to there. Once you see green, you're good. to the right to go on.
Can't see a thing. Gotta move that.
You'll see green, go hot.
Okay, we're going to get started in about 60 seconds. All right, good evening. I'm Allison Brashear. I'm the Dean of the Jacobs School of Medicine and Vice President for Health Sciences. And I just want to welcome esteemed faculty, dedicated learners, valued alumni, and distinguished guests. It is with great pleasure I want to welcome you all to the 4th annual Beyond the Night endowed lecture at the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at the University at Buffalo. Beyond the Knife is an initiative established by Dr. Steven Schweitzberg, Senior Distinguished Service Professor and Chair of the Department of Surgery. Along with his esteemed colleagues, it serves as a crucial platform for engaging in essential conversations surrounding racism and healthcare in the U.S. Dr. Schweitzberg, your vision and leadership in catalyzing these critical discussions have made a profound impact, and thank you. You can come up in a little bit. Not now. So my job is to talk a little bit about the school and past speakers. So past speakers have shed light on critical topics like gun violence, racial dynamics in medicine, the historical injustices ingrained in American gynecology, and the stark reality of pregnancy-related complications amongst Black women. This year, we will delve into the complex issue of racial inequality as it affects our families and our neighborhoods. We're deeply grateful to the Department of Surgery, particularly the Social Justice and Health Group, led by Dr. Mike Lamb, who's running around in his white tennies. He's really meticulously organized this impactful Beyond the Night lecture this year. For over 3 years, this dedicated group has convened bi-weekly meaningful conversations and spearheaded impactful projects aimed at abolishing structural racism. Tonight's program stands as a testament to their unwavering commitment. However, I just want to share that this lecture is just one aspect of the many impressive initiatives underway at the Jacobs School. So if you allow me to just highlight a few of the university's community events. The university's Community Health Equity Research Institute, supported by the president, tackles the root causes of health disparities, developing and testing innovative solutions to bridge these gaps within our region. The UB Veggie Van is a study that empowers partner organizations to establish their mobile produce markets. It increases access to fresh, healthy food in underserved communities. And Igniting Hope, held in this room each fall, unites medical school leaders in the Black community in collaborative efforts to dismantle structural racism and its detrimental effects. Last year's Igniting Hope, a Mother Pearl Young's Legacy Forum, was held in honor of a victim of the tragic Top shooting. We featured Dr. Barbara Ross Lee, a renowned advocate for health equity, and she was sparking conversations about the maternal mortality crisis in the U.S. Health in the Neighborhood, Reverend Pointer leads that group and helps us teach a course designed to educate medical students about the origins and consequences of health disparity, fostering empathy and understanding. The Muse curriculum embeds anti-racism principles at the core of our medical education. Recommendations from the students providing racial and socioeconomic context behind longstanding health issues in the Black community. And they are directly acknowledging the effects of systemic racism and the threat of violence in the physical health of people of color. The Trauma Surgery and Trauma-Informed Care elective offers a dual perspective on gun violence, and students gain hands-on experience treating victims in the emergency room and collaborate with their hospital partners. We have a hospital-based violence prevention program that seeks to disrupt the cycle of violence in our community. All of these immersive experiences expose students to the intersection of trauma-informed care, health disparities, and the social determinants of health. These are just a few of the examples of the transformative work that's happening across our school and all of UB. We want to extend our deepest gratitude to those who have made all of these initiatives possible and those who are making a difference in our community. The need for action extends beyond our walls. Each of us has a responsibility to dismantle systemic inequalities. And now I'm going to welcome back Dr. Steve Schweizberg to the podium, and he will continue the rest of the program. Steve?
That was so funny. Welcome. Thank you, Dr. Bashir. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, partners, distinguished guests, good evening. It is with great pride and a profound sense of responsibility that we welcome you to the 2024 fourth annual Beyond the Knife Lectureship, an event dedicated to advancing our understanding of crucial issues at the intersection of, for us, surgery, healthcare, our communities, and social justice. Today, we are honored to have with us a distinguished speaker, Dr. Deadric Williams, whose expertise and passion align with the theme of our event, anti-racism and health equity in our communities. The Beyond the Knife Lectureship has always aimed to foster meaningful discussions, inspire positive change, and encourage critical thinking within the medical community and our community as a whole. This year, we recognize the pressing need to address the deeply rooted challenges of structural racism and its profound impact on health equity. Dr. Williams, an esteemed expert in this field, will guide us through enlightening exploration of the complexities surrounding structural racism and its enduring consequences on health outcomes. In addition to Dr. Williams' insightful presentation, we're privileged to host a panel discussion that will bring together a diverse group of experts to delve deeper into these issues, providing a platform for dialogue, reflection, and action. Our collective commitment to dismantling barriers and fostering a more inclusive and equitable healthcare system will be at the forefront of our discussions today. As we embark on this intellectual journey, let us embrace the opportunity to learn, challenge our perspectives, and collaborate towards a future where every individual receives the highest quality of care, irrespective of their background. Together, we can contribute to building a healthcare landscape that is truly equitable, just, and reflective of the diverse communities we serve. Part of supporting our communities is being intentional about doing business in our communities. And to that end, this lectureship has engaged many of our colleagues in our communities. I want to thank Chef Ingram and his colleagues at Mana Restaurant last night on Northland. Really an amazing place to go if you've never been there. Chef Ramon from Brothers Restaurant, 475 Ellicott Street, for a fabulous treat. Afterwards, I invite you to welcome back Golden Cup Coffee with the amazing desserts. Yes. By Jackie. Everybody will leave here at least a half a pound heavier than when they came. They are on 1323 Jefferson Avenue, right next to the Tops, where we still mourn the horrific events of May 2022. I want to thank you for being part of this important conversation, and we want to strive for a future where health equity is a reality for all. I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of my partners in the Department of Surgery who helped fund this initial endowment. Thank you to all of you for going on this journey. I want to thank our amazing staff, and you'll get to meet Dr. Lamb in a minute, but so many other people from our office team, from our publicity team, and for all of our people that join us every other week who come as far away from Farmingdale, New York, from other schools. We're really thrilled, Tom, to have you here. And we couldn't do this. This truly takes a vision. So many shout-out thanks to all of our GME team, but a special thanks to Nargis and Amanda, who helped Mike in the background and make sure that the trains really do run on time. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce a member of our department, Dr. Michael Lamb, the UB Director of Surgical Education, who will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schweizberg. I'm Mike Lamb. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for engaging, for getting in the spirit, for helping us grapple together with the task before us. Tonight we are beyond honored to host Deadric T. Williams. Dr. Williams is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. In 2022, Professor Williams was chosen as a William T. Grant Scholar. It's a tremendous honor. If you don't know of it, each year the foundation recognizes small cohorts of particularly promising young researchers and gives them $350,000 to fund the next 5 years of their work. Right? So Grant Scholars are chosen because A, they already have these extraordinary research records, and B, it's clear to the foundation that the researcher in question has the potential to develop significant, influential, world-changing research in the future. It's an ultimate early career honor. That said, my first mind-blown moment with Professor Williams was on Twitter, and it was a post that went like this: conservatives ignore diversity to maintain whiteness. Liberals overinvest in abstract diversity to maintain whiteness. And this really struck a chord with me. It summed up the dilemma. It pointed unmistakably at the ever-present danger of premature self-congratulation, of spending all your energy wrestling with the wrong questions. One of the great gifts of the sociological imagination is this ability to put up for question every abstraction, every premise, right? Every bit of shared, quote-unquote, common sense. By their curiosity, by their questions, sociologists create new space for inquiry. And it's Professor Williams' unique personal gift to do it with humor, to do it with generosity, to do it with a sense of invitation, right? He's got this kind insistence that our foe is not our fellow human beings, but rather these brutal structures in which we are all entangled. The great promise of a conversation like this is that it provides us with new tools to think and to act so that we don't continue to reproduce these structures in our schools, in our workplaces, in our homes, right? Love the people, fight this system. So give it up, please, for Deadric T. Williams.
Testing. Oh, I like how this sounds. I like how this feels. There's many more people in the audience than when I first sat down, so thank you all for being here. I'm not going to stand behind the podium because I feel that over my few years in academia, it's restricting to my personality, and I love my personality, and I hope that you love my personality too. Before I begin, I need to say thank you to Dr. Mike Lamb for the invitation. To be quite honest with you, when he sent me the email and he told me the 3 prior speakers of this event, I wondered whether or not he had the wrong Deadric Williams. There's no way a person like Cornell West, my friend Deidre, and my new friend, other Dr. Williams, no relation, I don't think, to have been here before me, and then you ask little old me from rural Mississippi by way of Topeka, Kansas. So I appreciate your generosity, your kindness, and your passion for this particular work. It's people like you that I tilt the hat to and say again, thank you. Thank you for chauffeuring me around the city and all the kindness that you're showing me personally. I'm thankful for the dean, the chairperson as well of the college or school? School, thank you. Sorry about that. And all the people who are part of the committees to make this happen. Thank you. Now, because I only have 40 minutes and I have 200 slides, we're going to try to make this work. But before that, for the people who are behind the scenes, I have a special love and concern for them who set up these the tables, all of the stuff that goes on that people don't say thank you to. So thanks to all of you who are involved in that. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Now, I must say, I am an avid, I was going to say a football player, but those days are behind me. So I watched sport, and what came across my television during the playoffs was that Buffalo had to cancel a game. It looked something like this. So I am getting ready to watch the game, but it's canceled, and so my partner, she asks, "You sure you want to go to Buffalo in February?" So my response was, maybe, I don't know. It depends on the weather. And so we have been metaphorically blessed and literally blessed with the weather, and I appreciate that because moving from Nebraska to Tennessee, I'm spoiled with this newfound thing called spring that ends up happening. And so, again, thanks to everyone concerned, everyone who helped put this together, and I appreciate all the care that you've done for this event to take place. So, on the announcement, it was structural racism and persistent racial inequality. And like many scholars, I changed it at the last minute. And so it's structural anti-blackness. And I am going to tell you what all of that means. So let's start by first kind of getting an orientation of who I am as a scholar. So I study couple dyads. I'm a trained family sociologist and demographer. Much of my dissertation work focused on couples dyads, the idea of stress and health as a dyadic process. Imagine being in your intimate partnership, that your stress affects your health, but your stress also affects your partner's health, right? And so part of my work is to understand how couples, after the birth of a child, how their stress and health are associated with one another as the child develops over time. And much of this work, all three of my empirical studies from my dissertation, has been published, thank goodness. And I went into a postdoc in minority health disparities. In that, I started to understand, I moved away from stress and health, looking at using survey data to learning about biomarkers. And that's when my eyes began to open of how complex this thing called structural racism is. Because you may feel good if someone asks you, "How are you today?" "Oh, I'm well." But inside, maybe telling a different story. And so part of this work was to really look at things like cortisol, alpha amylase, and how stress, again, in one person affects their own stress response system, but how your stress also can affect your partner's physiological stress response system. And then I became an assistant professor and really pushing the boundaries to think about black families using racial stratification and CRT, critical race theory. Okay, I'm still here. All right. Using CRT as a particular framework to understand persistent racial inequality. So, before we begin, I like to make sure that myself and the audience have the same understanding of particular terms. So first, you're going to hear me say people racialize as black and people racialize as white. I do that on purpose to highlight race as a social construction, rather than saying black people and white people, okay? Thank you for the introduction about my humor, too. I think I'm funny, but my wife and kids, not so much, right? So I appreciate that, right? And so when I talk about structural racism, what I'm referring to is a set of ideologies and structures that not only make the ideal of race possible, but those ideologies and structures disproportionately benefit people who are racialized as white. Structural anti-blackness is a specific form of structural racism where the ideologies and structures are focused on people who are racialized as black. This could be structural anti-indigenous. This could be structural anti-Latinx. This could be structural anti-Asian. This could be structural anti-sexism, right? And structural heteronormativity. Because the ideologies and structures not only make the categories that we care about possible, but disproportionately benefit some while simultaneously disadvantaging others. So, race is not shorthand for the minorities, or even more eloquently, the blacks. Let that resonate for a little bit. When I talk about race, I am not using a shorthand to talk about the minorities or the blacks, right? And there is a tendency for people to think that racism is an individual level attribute whereby you have to be intentional to be racist. So racism, intentionality, is not a necessary condition for the maintenance of of white supremacy and anti-black racism. Is sufficient, but not necessary. Especially when we think about this thing called racial disparities in health. We know, as everyone who introduced someone else has profoundly said, that there is racial disparities in health. So racial disparities in health is a social fact, right? That we know empirically that on average, people who are racialized as black compared to people racialized as white are more likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease. We also know that African Americans are more likely to die at early ages. We know there's pregnancy-related mortality across racial lines. We know that there's maternal mortality rates that varies across racial lines. We also know empirically that even when we count for a thing called education, racial disparities in maternal health persist. And we know that infant mortality also varies greatly across racial lines. So why are we here? If we know this, why are we here? It's a rhetorical question. I'm glad no one answered. All right. While most people, let me rephrase. While most reasonable-minded people will not debate whether or not racial disparities exist, the problem often emerges when we start talking about why. While we know that racial disparities exist and persist, the debates often emerges when we start talking about why they exist and why they persist. My argument, the work that I do, in order to understand persistent racial disparities in health or any other outcome, we first have to understand the relationship between racism and race. And so I offer this particular slide. This is why I show my Intro to Critical Race and Ethnic Studies course. That do you believe that race leads to racism? Or does racism lead to race? How you answer this question speaks volumes about your assumptions about racism and race. So for the sake of the exercise, and I want to have a little fun, who would say A? right? Thank you. Who would say B? What if I told you? Oh, this is going to get really good. So I'm trying to like curb my enthusiasm right now. I'm really, really trying. But what if I told you both were correct? What if I told you that both? I got you now. Like you're really ready. But the perspectives are going to vary. That the idea that race leads to racism is often embedded in an essentialist perspective. That is, the idea that race is inherently biological or culturally real. Whereas racism leads to race often highlights the social construction of race. I am about to really get loose right now. Like, you all are really engaged. You're shaking your heads like, I'm trying to hold it together here, right? So if we look at racial essentialism, and the key assumptions that essentialist holds is that the belief that racial groups are biologically or culturally real that we often take for granted, that racial groups that exist like metaphorical manna from heaven, the assumption that racism is episodic, that slavery is an episode of American racism, Jim Crow is an episode of American racism, police killings in the United States are mere episodes of American racism, and racial inequality reflects a lack of individual effort on the part of the disadvantaged group. So, when we think about the connection between race and racial disparities in health, the assumption will look something like this. Pre-civil rights, overt racism? Sure. Everybody knows that. But what about the post-civil rights era of the emergence of individualism, or some scholars will refer to as neoliberalism, but we're not going to tackle that tonight. And so in a post-civil rights era, it's no longer the overt racism. It's simply individualism. If those people would just get their acts together, if those people, I am really preaching right now, y'all, I'm sorry, my bad. Whew. If those people would stop having kids out of wedlock, if those people would just eat right and do what they need to do, just obey the rules. So remnants of essentialism also exist in research. And this is the question that I tackle. Well, this is the question I critique heavily in my work, okay? So most scholars ask the question, whether it's health disparities, economic disparities, wealth, income, you name it, what accounts for the racial gap in a given outcome? And so here's an example of a conceptual model, a generic conceptual model. For those, I'm a quantitative sociologist, so I do a lot of statistics. And so we begin with this idea. Never mind. A race variable leading to a health outcome, right? So as I presented earlier, there's racial disparities in health. And what researchers want to understand is this bottom one, the mediating mechanisms. What accounts for the racial gap in health? And so here is an example of scholars looking for variables to account for racial disparities in health, right? I'm glad you're laughing, because I didn't want to date myself with the Scooby-Doo reference. So thank you, right? So is it family formations? Is it culture? Is it education? Is it employment? Or my personal favorite, is it neighborhood disadvantage? In research studies that use these variables and other variables in almost every research paper come to the conclusion that none of these factors fully account for the racial gap in health. So Fred, tell us, can you reveal us who's at play here? Thank you. I'm here all day. So what is it? If it's none of my favorite variables, if it's none of the things that I care about, what is it? Can you tell us, Fred? It's racism. Almost every research study on racial disparities in health, when they can't make the conclusion that their favorite variable is actually at play, it must be racism. But what if we start with racism? What if we stop playing around? Because these are the research questions that have been asked before I was even born. And we're still getting the same conclusions. And racism becomes some afterthought. But what if we start there? What if we also critique the way we do social justice? Because remnants of essentialism is also at play in social justice efforts. Take a drink right to it. When race is seen as an individual level attribute, there is a tendency for people to want to swoop down and save the day. And look what I did for the blacks. And then you want to get fancy. Look what I did for BIPOC people. Being anti-oppression does not mean you're pro-equity. One more time for the people in the back. Being anti-oppression does not necessarily mean you're pro-equity. It's a term that I use when I'm on social media and when people want to play Captain Save a Minority. So there's two things. Racial essentialism, the idea that race is biologically, culturally real, racism is episodic, and that inequality is a byproduct of the disadvantaged groups themselves, often get represented in that way in research and in social justice avenues. But, thank goodness for critical scholars. And my work challenges the remnants of essentialism. In two recent papers I published, Racism and Mechanisms Maintaining Racial Stratification of Black Families and Racial Disparities Without Racism. It's a follow-up article because I may or may not be writing a book at this time. So these pieces are a product of building the foundation of that book research. So when we shift gears, and those two papers that I recently published, it's really grappling with this question of race and racism, and whether or not the generic question, what accounts for racial disparities in health? And I argue that we need to understand social construction of race. Many of us were told that race is socially constructed. Rarely are we taught what the social construction of race means. So much of my work does a lot of hand-holding to walk us through what the social construction of race really means. So the key assumptions of the social constructionist perspective is that racial groups were created to standardize inequality. The inequality is a pre-existing condition. Okay. Inequality was a pre-existing condition that made racial categories possible. Okay? The magnum opus, let me try it another way, of racism is racial categorizations. Second, racism is an ongoing feature in the U.S., not episodic. And third, policies and laws are responsible for racial inequality. So until we understand this juxtaposition between racial essentialism and the social construction of race, we are going to forever talk around each other instead of talking to each other. So people will have separate monologues and not dialogues. So what I argue in my work, instead of asking what accounts for the racial disparities in health, I argue we should be asking what are the mechanisms via racism that maintains racial disparities in health. It's not as if racial groups were once equal and then became unequal. Racism, as an ongoing feature of the United States, adjusts itself and adapt to the changing landscape of ideologies and structures. So, my work is trying to set a new path that we can all walk, run, drive, skip, hop down, rather than the conventional ways we have been doing it for years. So formally, for me, structural racism is an ongoing, ever-changing system of ideologies and structures that not only make the ideal of race possible, but disproportionately benefit those who are racialized as white. So, in the first paper is my conceptual model. Don't worry, I am not going to give it to you all at one time. I am going to piecemeal it for you. And what I care about is the making, the maintenance, and the manifestation of racial stratification. Like the alliterations? Thank you, right? Hey. So, let's get with the first part. The making of racial stratification, that is, racism, is composed of two components. There's an ideological component and there's a structural component. The ideological component is beliefs about inequality. Remember, inequality predates this thing we call race. Turns out settler colonialists had to make sense of the inequality, because how can you preach a metaphorical sermon of life, liberty, and justice while you're committing genocide against natives? Stealing native land, the enslavement of Africans. You can do that by making an argument that human beings can be hierarchically ordered. There is a superior group and subordinate groups. It's not me, this is ordained. And then you create laws, policies, social practices, even discourse and language as structures to make your ideology a reality. So racial categories aren't just ahistorical demographic characteristics of the population. They're not just nominal variables. They are categorical relational hierarchy. That was a little tough right there. Sorry. So when we think about racial categories, it's not just nominal categories, but it is a it is a categorical relationship of who's on top and who's at the bottom. So it's always people who are racialized as white versus indigenous populations. People racialized as white versus people racialized as black, so on and so forth. Now, of course, we can have a conversation about how, quote unquote, minoritized groups relate to each other, but it's always in the context of their relationship with people racialized this way. Because a thing called anti-blackness is global. A thing called anti-blackness, the ideologies and structures that give meaning to black phenotypical features of people racialized as black, and the structures that are created in a given society around restricting access to opportunities and resources, it's a global phenomenon. So, how do we connect then the making of racial stratification with the manifestation of racial stratification? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Remember, inequality predates this thing called race, okay? So the inequality was already there. The creating of racial categories turned generic inequality into racial. I was going to say, can I get an amen or something? But the inequality already existed. The creation of racial categories made it racial inequality. So how does the making of these racial categories become manifested in the lives of human beings? You need two things. The ideological component to racism, the beliefs about inequality, gets converted into hierarchical boundaries, or what we may call racial prejudice. What does that look like? Ooh, your questions are awesome. It looks like this. The people who are putting up these signs, believe it or not, don't see it as a problem when a country has standardized it. So the ideological portion of racism gets converted to hierarchical boundaries that restrict access to some groups for valued resources. The second component is institutionalized barriers, or what we may call racial discrimination. Those structures, those laws, policies, social practices, even discourse and language becomes a kind of barrier that restricts access to opportunity. Well, what are some examples of those? Whew, you're all on fire, right? Naturalization Law of 1790, Indian Removal Act of 1830. I wonder what that did. How about this one? How about this one? So racism, as a system of ideologies and structures, they work independently, but they also coalesce for the purpose of perpetuating racial stratification via human behavior and human interactions. So in my work, I have moved away from calling individual people racist, because I think it's counterproductive. The system racism as a system was already created before any of us in this room were born. We participate in that system through human behavior. The question of what can I do and what can I not do is a byproduct of a system of racism. And laws and policies and social practices and discourse and language becomes ways to structure human interaction. So, I got a little ahead of myself there. Nope, I need to go back. No. Thank you for listening. Okay, right? So what I want to highlight here is not only racialized groups are a byproduct of the ideologies and structure via racism that makes these hierarchical boundaries, institutionalized barriers present, but there's examples with people racialized as black that this happens over and over and over. And yes, right? So how does that happen, right? So we take ideologies and structures during the chattel slavery era, right? The ideologies is biological superiority and biological inferiority. The structures is chattel slavery What happens is the arrow coming down to slavery is these superordinate group creating chattel slavery. The arrows coming up is the oppressed group fighting back against the system, what we call social movements, right? So if you read Du Bois's work in the Black Reconstruction, he talks about the general strike thesis in which enslaved men fought in the Civil War for their freedom. Whew. What happens? Now, you're freed. And let me make this statement here. There's a difference between being freed and freedom. There's a difference. You're freed from the legality of chattel slavery, but free to do what? So let's fast forward. Here we have a civil war. Oh my God, right? Up comes the Reconstruction era, right? Something happened. The Great Compromise of 1877. Guy by the name of B. Hayes becomes president as a byproduct of a shake-hand agreement between the two political parties. Yeah? With the intention of, hey, you can have the presidency, but you have to remove the federal troops out the South, which in reality becomes a proverbial up yours by both political parties. Ooh, that's a little aggressive. From both political parties for people racialized as black. Cue Jim Crow. So we get the rise of black codes that get converted into Jim Crow laws. Remember, racial inequality is America's equilibrium. So anytime there's a social movement fighting against the system, it corrects itself because it does not know how to do anything else. So we have the civil rights movement. Again, people from below, social movements, pushing back against the system, and cue individualism in a post-civil rights era. Or new sets, I'm sorry. The ideologies, cultural superiority and inferiority, the structures of Jim Crow laws. We move forward to colorblind racism in the post-civil rights era, but in your civil rights beautifully about this particular set of ideas. And then we have BLM, fighting back against the system, where structures, war on poverty, crime, drugs, because the focus then becomes on the individual. And if I ask my students, what perspective is that? And I always have a bright student in the back. That's essentialism. Ding, 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 ding. Our understanding of racism and race, as times moves on, is reproducing itself, especially in the post-civil rights era, in which individualism is rampant. So, how can the social construction of race help us to understand black-white health disparities, especially in the post-civil rights era? What I do in my work is I highlight three mechanisms that maintain racial inequality. Individual factors don't account for the racial gap. They maintain the racial gap. Structural racism and health researchers are beginning to construct quantitative measures of structural racism at the city and state, and even in some cases the county level, where city, state, and counties have a set of inequalities that actually impact the health of individuals in that particular county, city, or state. And what I talk about today is this idea of racialized space. I am not referring to racial residential segregation, because segregation is concerned with the distances between racialized groups. So what is the policy implication, I ask? Is the policy recommendation to segregation integration? If so, who integrates with whom? We've read that story before. So my focus on racialized space is about the spaces in which people live their everyday lives, where they shop, where they sleep, where they go to religious services. Space matters because race is socially constructed to justify pre-existing inequalities. Space becomes a kind of mechanism that reinforces the idea that racial groups are biologically real. And it does this in three ways. First, space is a race-making process. If racial groups, good versus bad, are in neighborhoods that are quote-unquote good versus bad, then it gives the illusion, the appearance that racial groups are real. So as a researcher, the reason I critique segregation research is that space itself, as a race-making process, as scholars who talk about plantation system with the big house and the slave quarters were in close proximity with each other, but you knew the difference. And there are scholars who study historical sociologists who use older census data to show how in certain areas like DC, where there were front streets and alleyways, they're in close proximity, but front streets are occupied by people racialized as white, and the alleyways are people who are racialized as black. They're in close proximity, but the spaces in which they occupy reinforces the logic of the hierarchy. Second, space becomes justifiable sites for oppression, domination, exclusion, right? The concentration of disadvantage, the building of interstate highways. Right? The killings of black people in predominantly black spaces. These things often coalesce to create what I call divergent racialized fates, in which experiences and interpretations of the world vary based on one's experiences in this country. So just as an example here, this is individual household income at the individual level on the x-axis, and the y-axis is neighborhood income. So what I'm highlighting here is, let's just look at people who are black and white, the blue and green, is that if you make 20 grand, if you're black, you're more likely to live in a neighborhood of 34,000, the average neighborhood income. As you move up the income, the personal income, the spaces in which these folks live still faces inequalities. So you can be racialized as black, for example, make 50 grand, but still live in a neighborhood on average where the average neighborhood income is 42.5. That's actually lower than people racialized as white who make 20 grand. Space, like black lives, matter. How do we get here? Well, really good question. Segregation, racial violence, restrictive neighborhood covenants, steering, right? Federal Housing Authority who had discriminating guidelines. So it's not just the federal government, state governments, but it's private practice as well. So how do we use this to understand health physiology? All right, I got some minutes left, so I'm gonna go through this. I'm in a room full of medical personnel, so I'm gonna go through this. All right, so when I encountered kind of human physiology, it literally like blew my mind, because how stress get under the skin to affect health disparities is important. So when we think about our stress system, so the sympathetic nervous system happens when we encounter a stressor, and the parasympathetic is when we're recovering from that particular stressor. Now think about if you're giving a speech, right? You're a freshman, it's speech 101, you go in, right? Your heart is racing, right? You're trying to give a speech, right? Your palms are sweaty, mom's spaghetti. Oh, I'm glad you got that reference too. Thank you. All right. So imagine, right? You're faced with, because we live in a racialized society in which experiences vary, our brains then, given our experience, interprets a particular stressor in a particular way. We face that stressor, Our bodies are built to deal with acute stress, but not chronic stress. No, right? Right? So we're looking at a particular stressor, interpreting that stressor, right? Let's get an example. It's going to be a weird example, it's an example nonetheless. Imagine you're getting chased by a bear. Now, I moved to East Tennessee 4 years ago. That could happen. That could, that could happen. Let's say you're getting chased by a bear, right? Your fight or flight kicks in, right? I'm not fighting the bear. I'm strong, but I'm not that strong, okay? I'm running away, right? I'm running away. And let's say you get away from that bear, right? That you're like Jackie Jonah Kersey, like you got out of Dodge, right? So our physiological health response system is normal. We encounter a stressor, some demand on us, the high graph above. When the bear goes away, our physiology goes back to normal equilibrium, kind of a normal stress response system, because the body can respond to acute stressors. Let's say you have to face a bear every damn day, and there is no coming down for you. That every day your stress response system is elevated. Your cortisol levels are high. What if that bear is racial discrimination? What if that bear is poverty? What if that bear is economic hardship where people can't pay their bills? What if? Every damn day you're dealing with some metaphorical bear and your physiology just can't keep up. And it put us at risk of cardiovascular disease. So what happens? What about Buffalo? What about the spaces in Buffalo? Yeah, one dot equals a person. It's color-coded to represent a racial group. What you see, ladies and gentlemen, what you see, sorry about the ladies and gentlemen part, is racial residential segregation in Buffalo, New York. And this is 2010 census data, right? And I want to highlight the Economic Innovation Center's work was seven variables that they tap into to understand the quality of a particular space by county. So whether or not, high school diploma, poverty rate, adults not working, so on and so forth, right? And so you can get graded from prosperous to distress. This blew my mind. So what I want you to see is that on average, in the United States, people racialized as black are more likely to live in distressed or at-risk zip codes compared to their white counterparts. This is Buffalo. It's a lot of red. It's a lot of orange. And the critical question becomes why? Why? Should we build a community garden? Thank y'all for getting that. Should we hold hands and have a campfire? Kumbaya. So when we connect this space with health, you're looking at concentrated disadvantage, lack of access to quality health care, medical distrust, and we expect people to respond to our concerns when there's a history that the United States have not tackled? I mean, we live in a country where we have legislated the behaviors of people racialized as white, but never legislated the conditions of people racialized as black. We've told people you can't own people. That's unconstitutional. What do you do to the newly freed persons? We tell people, hey, you can't legally discriminate. Civil rights legislation. What did you do to the people who had to endure not having access to resources for 11 years? So, in closing, what I want to highlight to you is that we live in a country where racial disparities are so prevalent, so normative, that it has created a political and racial divide. So when we ask people about over the last 50 years, blank progress have been made. A lot of progress, a little, not at all, a lot, a little, not at all, right? For more needs to be done. So when we look at over the last 50 years, the progress for people racialized as white, 56% says progress has been made compared to only 19% of people racialized as black. For more needs to be done, a lot needs to be done for people racialized as white, 42% compared to people racialized as black, 78%. And this is a lot on this table, but I promise you it's worth it. When you look at people racialized as white, the question is, who say percentage blank to ensure equal rights for all Americans? They have a darker brown because they are fundamental bias against some racial and ethnic groups. Most laws and institutions need to be completely rebuilt. Versus, while there are many inequities, necessary change can be made by working within the system, and then the gray is little and nothing needs to be done. When you look at people racialized as white by age, college experience, and whether they're Republican or Democrat, it speaks for itself. And look at those same numbers when we look at people racialized as black. It's more than just racial disparities in health. It's our interpretation of what can be done about it. So when we move forward, we need to think about racial inequality as a failure of human rights, period. It's not just differences in some outcomes. It is a violation of human rights. And we have casually, as academics, made it about this disparity language, when the truth of the matter is that this country has neglected people racialized as black. We need New Deal type policies. Remember, we had New Deal policies. But there was a structure called Jim Crow laws. And we need state policies. What's the state budget? What resources are going where? There's much can be done. The question becomes, do we want to do anything? And we is very loosely here. I'm talking about a collective we. Do we want to change? Do we want to play white saviorism for the rest of black folks' lives? Or do we want to critique white supremacy as a system that make racial inequality a thing to begin with? The presence of racial inequality is inextricably linked to the omnipresence of white supremacy as a system. You can't engage one while rendering the other one invisible. You have to do it together. Racial inequality is like saying, hey, we want to increase diversity. But we haven't done anything to decrease the whiteness that is ever present on college campuses. All you're doing is recruiting people of color to a predominantly white space in which their cortisol levels get spiked because no one's going to listen to them. And for the social justice advocates, we have to think about whiteness as a system that's inextricably linked to racial inequality, what I just said. We need to understand that racism affects the health of people racialized as black. And luckily, the AMA has put forward and recognized that racism is a public health threat. It's a start. It's not the end. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, once again, thank you for a very thought-provoking conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, welcome to the 4th annual Beyond the Knife event. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Timothy Adams, and I am a colorectal and general surgeon within the State University of Buffalo Surgical Department. I am a member of the governing board at Kaleida Health, and I am delighted to have you join us for this insightful discussion on structural racism and persistent racial inequality. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists and champions for social justice who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. Our first panelist, Dr. Levan E. Ansari, is the CEO and Executive Director of the Community Health Center of Buffalo Incorporated. She holds a bachelor's degree in professional studies from Brockport State College, a master's degree in multidisciplinary studies from the State University of New York College at Buffalo, and a PhD in sociology of education from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She is an educator, administrator, and manager with over 20 years of experience in equity and diversity, workforce development, higher education, community-based health care, and hospital administration. Next, we have Chandra Ridfern. Chandra is the CEO of the Buffalo Federation of Neighborhood Centers and is best described as a compassionate, creative, and visionary servant leader. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Canisius University. As a nonprofit executive with over 20 years of experience, Chandra is known as a leader who strives to create diverse and strategic partnerships that make a community impact. The Buffalo Federation of Neighborhood Centers, a New York community-based nonprofit organization birthed from the Settlement House movement, has provided Chandra with the opportunity to develop the insight and expertise to create solutions to help those most in need of assistance. Her previous roles at the BFNC have included serving as the Chief Operating Officer, Director of Residential Services, Coordinator of Adult Case Management, and Director of Support Services for Buffalo Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Services. Our final panelist, Dr. Ron Stewart, not only was issued an executive chamber proclamation declaring December 8th as Dr. Ron Stewart Day by Buffalo's Mayor Byron Brown, but he also received an executive chamber citation for his accomplishments and high standards of professional excellence from New York State Governor Kathy Hochul. He holds an associate's degree in sociology from Bishop State Community College, a bachelor's degree from Tuskegee University, and 2 master's degrees, one in sociology and one in African American studies from The Ohio State University. He earned a PhD in sociology from Howard University in 1990, joining Buffalo State University faculty that same fall. Today's moderator, Rita Hubbard Robinson, is the CEO of New Water and Associates, LLC, and has been committed to the improvement of health and social determinants of health for over 30 years. She is currently under contract with the African American Health Equity Task Force. She is building the infrastructure of the newly formed community-based Buffalo Center for Health Equity. Rita is a graduate of the University of Buffalo Law School, where she received her JD degree. She completed undergraduate work at the State University at Binghamton, where she earned a bachelor's degree in history. She has served in the position of Director of Institutional Advancement at the Erie County Medical Center Lifeline Foundation. Please put your hands together and join me in welcoming our respected panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams, for your introductions and actually for your work. I'm so glad that you are in our community doing such fine work for the citizens of our city. I'm going to start with a question for Dr. Ansari. She and I have a long relationship. We used to work on race issues just a couple days ago. And she is a real important leader in our community, serving many, not only in the city of Buffalo, but across Western New York in healthcare. And I thought it would not be robbery just to ask you this question, and that would be applied to Dr. Williams' presentation. What do you see the role of community health centers in providing health care and breaking down barriers to health care or health access?
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, everyone. Let me just say, I'm going to talk about, can you hear me? I want to just say that I appreciated the lecture because I'm going to give you real life to this. A federally qualified health center, for those of you who don't know, is we are mandated by the federal government to take care of everyone regardless of their ability to pay. I'm just going to leave it there. But my job as one of the only African American leaders in healthcare is to interrupt the structural racism so I can save people's lives every day. Thank you. Let me tell you how that works. I'll give you a couple of examples. COVID-19. We were one of the only health centers that stayed open when everything else was closing. And why do we do that? We only had prayer, and there was no evidence on as a disease that was not seen in 102 years. So what do we have to rely on? I had to call my young providers and tell me what you got. What God has delivered you with the intelligence and the skills as physicians and dentists. I got physical therapists. I said, we got to go to work because we're dying. And we were so conditioned to say, they said, well, Dr. Ansari, we don't have any evidence that we can use the medication for these symptoms. I can't curse in here. Mm-hmm. I said, we got prayer and we got the talent and the license that you have. What medication will you give for the symptoms that we're seeing? Because the only thing we had was what people were telling us. That was our evidence. If we waited for the RIBs and all that, we would be dead. So we had to break the system. We had to break through antibiotics, wherever we had that we knew to deal with those symptoms, that's what we went to work on. But we also were risking our own lives. A dentist can't stay 6 feet apart, away. We had to have people were getting ready to die because they had abscess in their teeth and their mouth. And we were the only ones open. I had one N95. I want to tell you, when it's time for the human being to step up to the plate, these laws go out the window because we have to save lives. I'm not saying to violate them, because all the meds and all the protocols we put in place were already FDA approved. But we didn't have any research to tell us what medications we could use because it didn't exist. So that's one incident of showing how you have to interrupt racism. Because remember, they didn't give any vaccines to the communities of color. We didn't have any tests when they first came out. We had to fight. The second incident to show you how racism will kill us. Just by the way, all of us in here know that when a baby is born, there is no race. It just cries. It's all equal. So when 514 occurred, my health center is only 2 miles away. A lot of my staff members live around there. Happened on Saturday. We were on the ground by Monday morning at the Meriwether Library with the TOPS associates and everybody else that was impacted. They were in active PTSD. The reason we went out to the field in the street, because we come from there. I took every talent I had, my MDs, my nurses, my social workers. I didn't know what we were going into. But we broke the system again. Guess what? All their medications, their purses, their IDs. You think I'm going to ask for an ID in your insurance when you're in active PTSD? We got 10 of our residents, our seniors dead from hate. So I talked to the insurance presidents and I said, what are we going to do when these emergencies come, these man-made ones? We're not getting paid for that, to go out into the community. And by the way, we're not trained in terrorism. Medicine is not trained in terrorism and white supremacy. I had to study it. I understand racism, but I didn't understand how white supremacy shows up in a community. Because the TOPS associates saw him for weeks coming in their store. So if racism was that obvious, we would have saw it and would have saved our own lives. But an ideology we didn't see. But it was in the structure. So I give you these 2 examples because today, all of us sitting in here in medical school and MDs understand that trauma is part of their primary care for the rest of their lives. You cannot escape that. So I'm giving you these examples because that's the life that we live in these systems when we have to save people's lives because we have to interrupt it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ansari. I would say that your comments remind me of Dr. Williams' example of the bear that shows up every day. And to that end, I'd like to connect back to you, Dr. Williams. You punctuated the impact of the social determinants of health in your presentation. These are the things that happen every day, it's all the things that we interact with every day. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about how structural racism impacts our families' health. I think we've been sort of talking about it in a number of different ways, but how do we move forward? How do we get to the other side? If you have any examples or any suggestions or recommendations.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank to the audience for your kindness. I get emotional sometimes with this. It's a lot. So thank you. So much of to respond to your question, I think it's going to sound like really simple, but it's much more complicated. And one of the things that we learn in kind of mental health spaces is that in order to fix a problem, we have to first admit that a problem exists. And I think the reason I showed the audience the public opinion data is to demonstrate how divergent we are as a country on interpreting racism and racial inequality. And so if a country cannot agree on the on empirical evidence that racial inequality is a thing and racism is still a part, is still stitched into the American fabric, then we have a fight uphill. And so on the one hand, there is a need to be serious about the realities of this country. We're having debates about history. And that's as a sociologist who leans on history. I tell my historian friends that I'm a historian with a sociological imagination. I care about history because our contemporary understanding of contemporary inequality is a byproduct of that. And so the thing that what can be done is multifaceted. We have to be ambitious. And there's things I can say, but to say them knowing that we are we again live in a country where we cannot agree on simple historical facts, then that becomes problematic in moving forward. I think there is a need, and the reason I do the work that I do about challenging does racism leads to race or race leads to racism, because it's a fundamental flaw in our imaginations when it comes to racism and racial inequality. There is this real assumption that racial groups are biologically real or culturally real inherently, and that racism is only about people who do individual egregious things against other individuals or groups of people. And it's much more complicated than that. And if we can't agree on simple historical, like the fact that we have to have conversations about whether or not the U.S. is a racist country, I mean, that's daunting to people who have to live in a world in which they feel like no one listens. And so I'm not giving you answers on purpose here, largely because I think that's the first step. There's a collective effort of recognizing. But if we leapfrog that, and let's say there's tangible things we can do, I think that understanding that racial inequality is a violation of human rights is powerful to me. Because then we have to admit that the country has been negligent. And for me, that's important. But again, it ties to, so again, I can't bring up solutions. I have several, but I'm not bringing them up now because I think those things are inextricably linked. The lack of a kind of historical orientation that Americans really don't want to kind of grapple with, and the fact that we have done many citizens in this country a disservice, and then we just package it as racial disparities to make it sound good for various organizations to get grants. I'm a grant writer myself, for academic purposes, but the brutal reality is a violation of human rights. And so we must first recognize that those things before we even can break ground, or we'll be repeating the same frustrations of a colleague down the table. It's like we have to beg people to do stuff to save lives. And in my opinion, the fundamental issue even to that is our inability, inability to grapple with the brutal reality and having an honest understanding of the country's history. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I think one of the things that I'm feeling in this moment is a tension between the present reality and a need to address our issues. I mean, we've had some horrible occurrences, from natural disasters to human hate. And so we have, I think, an urgency to do something, not to kind of water down this, but to take the lemons that we have and make them into a better experience for us, right? And so I know this is these are some of the things that Chandra does and leads about in her work as the CEO of BFNC. And in your work, in your writings, you talk about leverage points. And one of the things that I know we all have to do is use these leverage points to do an act in the present while dealing with some of these underpinnings that you just discussed, like getting everybody on the same page and understanding that human rights have been violated and there should be some accountability. But at the same time, we do know that we need to do something. You know, we have children, we have elders, and then there's us in between, and we know we have to deal with the medical traumas that Dr. Ansari just talked about, at present. At the same time, we can learn in a space like this and grapple with some of these esoteric or underpinnings that you described. So my question to Chandra is about how are you employing leverage and leverage points and leveraging opportunities around structural racism in the work that you do every day?
Well, that's a good question, and thank you for that question. So the unique thing about us is we're in community. Like, we are literally in community, right? And that's one of the greatest leverage points that we have, is that we believe in being in community, working inside community, and not necessarily trying to take people other places. So one of the things is, how do we come up with more innovative approaches to addressing, like, the social determinants of health? We have to think of ways that, you know, our Black and brown people are going to be able to get this information. So for us, if that means that I have to figure out how to bring the yoga instructor in to do yoga to Motown music, that's what we do, right? And guess what? My seniors, they come faithfully every week. And if that means to get you to be a little bit more active, I gotta have the line dancer come in. Then that's what we do, right? Because it's not about what mainstream says is going to work. I get it, but everybody cannot afford a gym membership. They're not going to go. They don't even want to exercise. But we know we need to do these things. And so it's really about bringing things inside that people are going to feel comfortable with. And so often we have this concept of we have to go someplace to obtain something that someone else says is good for us. When if we go back to looking at a lot of traditional healing patterns, right, from African people, right, we did a lot of self-healing. And so, you know, we believe that we have to meet people where they are. And so we start where we have to. We sponsor a lot of healing circles. We have a wonderful project we did with Community Health Center of Buffalo through Arts That Heal. And we really look to have partnerships that are going to make a significant impact. So if we partnered with Community Health Center of Buffalo with Arts That Heal, well, that's an introduction to a health clinic for my people, right? People who may not even go to the doctor. So that was their introduction. Not only that, the people that are servicing them look like them. And so another thing we do at BFNC is that probably 95% of the people that work for us, they look like the people they serve, or they live in the neighborhoods, or they have family members that live in the neighborhoods, or they themselves have been affected in some way. And we purposely do that because it's really difficult if you don't have an understanding of where people are coming from to really assist them, right? And Dr. Williams talked about, you know, that savior concept. So we go in, we do this intervention, and you're all good. And that's not the concept that we employ at BFNC. The other major thing that we do is we advocate. Right? And so, yes, everybody needs money and everybody wants the grants. But at some point, you have to stop and say, if this is not helping the people that it's intending to help, or we can't do it in the way that is going to be beneficial to the people, we're not going to do it. So, no, you can't come in and research with my people and me bring my people to you and you give them a gift card for $20. It doesn't work for me. Okay? So you can't come in and pick people's brains and ask them to expose and be re-traumatized with some of the questions you're asking, and then you go away and we don't see you anymore. So before we as an organization decide that, okay, you know, we as a trusted source are going to say, these are good people to work with, we need to know how invested you are in really helping these people. So those are a few of the things that we do. Certainly we could talk on and on about this, but those are some of the points that we utilize at BFNC.
Thank you so much. So again, we find ourselves at these tension points, listening to and talking with our academician, learning about, the real life and death scenarios that are happening in our healthcare centers, and then what's happening right in the community in the person of Chandra Redford. And we appreciate, and these are all, I think, I'm not the professional at this moment. I'm just the facilitator. But I do think that these are all part of the various mechanisms that are necessary in order for us to get from where we are to a better place. And so my next question is for Dr. Stewart. Dr. Stewart, I'd like to drill down just a little bit more in our talk and get down to a conversation about Black families. You have focused on the sociology of Black families for decades. And I thought it would be robbery to ask you, in what ways has the recent growth of interest in this field changed or solidified your own practice, and where do you see the field and this work heading?
Thank you for that question. My mic's working, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Before I address that question, I have some prepared comments I'd like to share. Professor Williams alluded to the idea that we need some sort of historical context. I think I can provide that with my comments. First, I'd like to thank the Jacob School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences for inviting me to be a part of this panelist tonight. I especially like to thank Professor Lamb for asking me to be on the panel because I'm never one to miss an opportunity to talk about what I refer to as the specter that haunts the United States, the specter of racism. I graciously accepted his invitation, and I'm truly honored and humbled by the opportunity to be here. Indeed, I like the optics of the University of Buffalo and the optics of the University of Buffalo and Buffalo State University working collaboratively to sort of address some of the concerns that we're talking about at this auspicious event this evening. In my career, I have had the pleasure of teaching numerous courses in sociology, yet I think the 3 courses that I teach specifically is what qualifies me to be a member of this venerable panel. The 3 courses are the African American family in the United States, number 1, seminar on the African American male in the United States, number 2, and a course on race and ethnic relations. In each course, without fail, I have examined structures of racism. While I would be professionally remiss if I did not cover the topic, I abhor having to do so. It is abhorrent because I would rather spend my time teaching about the undoing of racist policies and practices instead of teaching about racism's immutability. This is especially problematic given that this semester I adopted a textbook titled Ethics and Race. And straight out of the gate, my students have learned that ethics or morality has 2 sides, right and wrong. Per the United States, ethically speaking, the country is morally bankrupt in terms of the staying power of racism and its implications for the quality of life and well-being of African Americans and other marginalized populations. Still, even though it is abhorrent to me, I have a job to do as a professor, and in doing so, often I must pretend I do not recognize the white fragility on the faces of some of my white students when I discuss the atrocious and barbaristic behaviors members from their community, both past and present, have inflicted upon members of mine and other racially aggrieved groups, both past and present, and I imagine, as the Black Lives Matter movement attests to, in the future. I teach students that the health outcomes for African Americans are adversely impacted by history, a history replete with examples of the medical profession treating African American men and women as guinea pigs, the Tuskegee syphilis study and the experimental gynecological procedures performed on Black women without their consent or the use of commonly available anesthesia are 2 of the most striking examples. Such racist practices create distrust and an uneasiness about going to the doctor among members of my community. In contrast, for those that do visit physicians, more often than not, their illnesses have progressed to more critical stages wherein preventive and curative practices are negligible. It is abhorrent to teach about racism because I have to be unequivocal in letting students know I eschew any pretense of subscribing to the ideal of a colorblind society. If it is a colorblind society, how is it possible for me to begin each race and ethnicity class with a student presenting his or her current event requirement on the topic? For example, yesterday, a student presented a current event on the topic on the Nazis who marched in Nashville, Tennessee, your home state, over the weekend. Colorblind my ass. And sometimes you have to be, in the words of the great Joe Madison, the recently deceased Black Eagle, sometimes you have to be profane to be profound. It is abhorrent because as I teach the course on the African American family and discuss how racism has contributed to the marginalization of African Americans, particularly African American males, in the opportunity structure, I have to look into the African American male's eyes and see their trepidation and weariness. These feelings are exacerbated when these same young men realize they have to learn to navigate and successfully negotiate three pernicious structures of racism: institutional decimation, institutional deprivation, and institutional subsidization. Decimation having to do with the killing of African American men, depleting them from the population. Deprivation is the involuntary under, sub, and unemployment of African American males, and subsidization is manifested in the form of public assistance, which reduces the explosive potential of the communities from which these young men come from. Also, they will be required, thank you. Also, they will be required to learn that in spite of having to deal with institutional structures of racism, they too must deal with the most insidious factor impacting them: negative images and stereotypes. Again, it is abhorrent to teach about racism in the race and ethnicity class because, unfortunately, our beloved city of good neighbors does not get a free pass. In other words, the city of Buffalo is not immune to racist animus. Students will become, in this particular class, students will and have become conscious of how Amherst, New York, a neighboring suburb, was once declared the safest city in the country, while at the same time, if you cross Bailey Avenue at Maine, you enter into the city of Buffalo, which perennially ranked as one of the most impoverished. Speaking of national infamy, they will learn that in addition to Buffalo being ranked as one of the most impoverished cities in the country, the city has also been nationally ranked for being one of the most segregated cities in the country. I shudder to mention that it has also been notorious for having one of the highest unemployment rate for its black males. Further, they will learn why the great exemplar of U.S. jurisprudence, the late great Johnny Cochran, came to town in the early 1990s. Notable for our dialogue this evening, I will teach them about the incongruity between African Americans who live in the heart of one of the best health care delivery systems in the country, yet their outcomes mirror that of a third world. A predecessor to me being on this panel, similar to this one, Dr. Henry Taylor, who sits over there, has painstakingly demonstrated throughout empirical research the dire health outcomes of black Buffalonians. His findings reveal, among other negative outcomes, premature death among blacks is nearly twice that of whites. Also, if they are privy to the reputation of Charleston, South Carolina, and an unfathomable act of racial violence, I should not have to teach them that Buffalo is now among the cities with a similar reputation, i.e. 5/14/2022. And sadly, they will learn about my personal experiences with racism while living in Buffalo, with the most egregious being a letter I received within my first 2 years living here. Now, I've been in Buffalo for 34 years. I came here in 1990. So within my first 2 years, Dr. Williams talked about stress and hypertension and all kinds of other conditions that emanate from racism. So this, in my first 2 years, I've carried this with me for 32 years. I received what I refer to as a fan mail, a fan letter. And in that fan letter, the writer, a resident of Amherst, New York, and I'm sorry I'm not picking on Amherst because I mentioned him once, I mentioned him again, and I got him again to come. A resident of Amherst, New York, referred to me with such colorful language as in the letter that was mailed to me at my office at Buffalo State University. Number one, a effing filthy N-word. Number two, a turd on two legs. Number three, a jitterbugging shit skin. Number four, coonhead spade. Number five, shadow boy. Now, mind you, I spent the first quarter century of my life in Alabama, a state infamous for its racial antipathy, and I do not recall ever hearing such vitriolic nomenclatures. Speaking of Alabama, though it would be abhorrent to do so, I will enjoin all the students I am teaching this semester to be sure to visit the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, a museum that chronicles the history of the destructive violence that shaped our nation from the slave trade to the era of Jim Crow and racial terror lynching to our mass incarceration crisis. A footnote to charging them to visit the Legacy Museum would be me asking them to research the history of anti-lynching legislation in the United States. Their research will reveal it took more than 100 years to pass the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, which was passed in March of 2022. The first laws that were brought to Congress was in the 1920s. Continuing to elaborate on what I find to be abhorrent when teaching about racism and its intractability in U.S. society, two more points require mentioning, one being germane to racism in healthcare or the lack thereof for many blacks and other marginalized populations. In my African American family course, I abhor having to share with the class 30 tips for surviving police stops. These tips were recommended by a prominent Buffalo attorney, an attorney who actually sat where I'm sitting 2 years ago, Attorney John Elmore. I tell them of paramount importance is the tip number 11, because I can attest to its importance. On the night of December 12th, 2018, I was stopped by a policeman in Amherst for allegedly swerving in my car. Once I realized this officer wanted to arrest me for something, he searched my car inside and out, damn near pulled the back seats out, searched inside the trunk, lifted the cover over the spare tire and lifted up the spare tire looking for shit. Profane to be profane. Didn't find nothing. But the point number 11 reads that in any encounter with the police, your primary goal is to make it home. Is to make it home. George Floyd, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Manuel Ellis, Andre Hill, Sandra Bland, or Breonna Taylor, who was actually at home, didn't make it home. Luckily, I did. Finally, also in the African American family course, we will discuss healthy living. The conversation here revolves around healthy dieting, exercise, and avoiding becoming a health disparity statistics. Here specifically, we will discuss a recent white paper issued by the American Sociological Association called Race and Racism in the United States, a sociological guide for the public. In it, it states, and I quote, "Systemic racism also shapes access to quality health care," end of quote. History is replete with examples of structural racism adversely impacting the health and well-being of African Americans. The ASAP suggests the treatment of African Americans during slavery set in motion policies and practices that continue to this day in terms of denying adequate access to healthy food, safe working conditions, medical treatment, and a host of other social inequities that negatively impact the health status of African Americans. Inequities such as a large percentage of African Americans not having health insurance compared to their white counterparts, a significantly lower life expectancy, and an infant mortality rate more than twice that of whites, and significantly higher maternal mortality rates. You know, one thing that I find to be somewhat of a new phenomenon is all these African American women who run the risk of dying during child care. I mean, labor and delivery. You know what I mean? My first child was born. We had a midwife, and that's all we had. It cost $800, no problems. And now some black women have some of the best health care in the country, and yet they're dying from procreation. I don't understand that. Doctors, y'all need to do something about that. Y'all need to fix that quick, fast, and in a hurry. In closing my comments, what I have tried to demonstrate through both scholarly and anecdotal examples is that structural racism is real. It is not a figment of African Americans' collective imagination. Therefore, practitioners who work for the healthcare industrial complex, if they are to live up to the ideals of the Hippocratic Oath, must be mindful of and do everything in their power when serving members of the African American community to mitigate its nefarious impact. Oh, now, do I still have to answer your question? I mean, I think I got it out there somewhere. But you know, what I do at Buffalo State, I've been teaching at Buffalo State for 34 years, and I go hard in terms of the value of education. Dr. William down there is from Mississippi. Dr. Stewart here is from Mobile, Alabama. And I don't know about him, but I come from abject poverty. I used to hang out on the landfill and find food on the city dump. That's where I come from. And now, because of education, it has changed my life, and I have done, in terms of playing it forward. Dr. Chris St. Ville, could you please stand up and wave? That young man right there is a guy who walked in my class like he owned it. 20 minutes late, walked in like he owned it. If I wasn't in this quarters, right, I would have said some other words, but I'm going to keep it clean. But he walked in my class like he owned it. And he was late, had on a pair of army fatigues, Timberland boots, and 20, 30 minutes late. And I told him, I said, sir, could I see you after class? And he came to my office, and he'll tell you. I grabbed him in his chest and said, what the F wrong with you? I did that. He'll tell you that. I'm not making this up. Long story short, Dr. St. Ville, he and I got together because we understood the need for African-American males having support at PWIs. They need that support because they got to navigate, oftentimes, environments that are racially hostile to them. Which should be environments that should be supportive and nurturing are oftentimes racially hostile. So Dr. St. Ville and I created AMEN, the African American Male Empowering Network, where Dr. St. Ville, who came to Buffalo State from a reform school, the bus dropped him off at Buffalo State, was the first president. He was the first president of that organization. And now he's a PhD from my alma mater, Howard University. He's a renowned professor at UB School of Social Work. And he's not the first African American male that I have had that type of influence on. And women, don't get it twisted, and African American women. And so that's what I do. I tell them that education can change your life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. I want to thank this esteemed panel. I think it's a phenomenal panel. I'm humbled by just being in the room and between these fantastic professors and practitioners, and really count it a blessing. I would like to ask you, if you would, to give another applause for the work that they do every day and the work they've done on the panel today. I'd like to turn our attention back to Dr. Williams, who's going to provide us a reflection on, I'm sorry? Sorry? Oh, you're right. Didn't mean to rush that part.
She's ready to get out.
We do have questions that we want to offer those in the audience to share with our panel. But before I have us do that, I wanted to make mention to those who are on the internet. We do have audience online that have been participating. I know you've seen the smiling faces, the laughs, the applauses, the tears on our screen here in the M&T room. We want to offer them an opportunity to ask questions. Dr. Lamb is looking at his computer and will jot down a few questions. We'll take as many as we can, probably one or two. So if you're interested in asking a question, you can put it in the chat. We ask you that you give your name and who you want this question to be posed to, as well as the question. And I want to ask all of you who might have questions in the room to do the same. Provide your name, who you would like to make this question to, and to then pose your question. I think there are a couple of people in the room with mics, and if you would, I see a lady here in a green sweater. She's got a mic, so thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Frankie Uetra. I'm one of the surgery residents here at UB. My question is for Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for your talk. It was so enlightening and empowering. So you've mentioned today that one of the key questions you think that is necessary to ask for anyone seeking meaningful change in racialized spaces is, what are the mechanisms via racism that maintain the racial gap in an outcome of interest? Given that we're predominantly healthcare professionals here, can you speak on some specific actionable mechanisms that you see in the healthcare sector today?
And is that in terms of from the healthcare or people going to the healthcare?
Within the healthcare space, for practitioners or future practitioners, medical students such as are here, what can you see that we could be acting on to change?
Awesome, I get it now. Thank you for clarification. So there's some really good work coming out around medical students and kind of racial inequality, right? And so one of those striking studies showed that medical students understood people who are racialized as Black, their pain tolerance was different than people who are racialized as white, right? Which is weird in so many ways. And so based on that, based on the fact that people are doing that research and that we are seeing these disparities in how people interpret other people's bodies, I think is a move in the right direction, right? So my comment earlier was in order to fix a problem, we have to admit that a problem exists. And for me, that's a huge problem when you believe that certain people with phenotypical features kind of tolerate pain more so than others. That has implications for a ton of things. And so part of what the research is doing is highlighting the need for medical professionals to be more conscientious, right? We're entering, and I don't use this word lightly because I critique this word too, so the idea of bias, right? Like, bias exists because of structural conditions that make those biases possible, right? So recognizing that, I think, is first, like, the research is being done. But as a human being, coming into a space, helping other human beings, is recognizing that history and being sensitive to that history. And so sometimes human interactions often are weird because people are talking around each other instead of talking to each other. When people have been treated a certain way and enter medical facilities and they're kind of hesitant, like, instead of making a bad situation worse, The question then becomes, how can I be of use, of value to that person who needs care? And looking at it from a perspective of humanity. Like, people are upset, and people have a right to be upset given how they have been ignored over the years in this country, especially in terms of health and the medical distrust that I spoke about earlier. So I think there is a need for people to understand other folks as human beings and being sensitive to the histories of this country around a ton of disadvantaged groups, right? It's so just anecdotally here, my partner has a rare disease, and there's a doctor who's racialized as white who was leading expert on this disease. We moved to Knoxville, and she came home crying. Because we moved from Nebraska to Knoxville knowing that there's a doctor who specializes in her rare disease. She comes home crying because she felt like her voice was not heard to the doctor, and he was suggesting a ton of treatments. And for context, my wife also has a PhD, so she's like, I know the research. Don't tell me to take hormone pills, right? I have a particular disease that he was mostly in bed with the insurance company, we found out later. And so she ends up going to California, where there is a big treatment center for her rare disease, and that doctor treated her as a human being first. And so that particular example of recognizing that people have needs and have, like, in the history of that, especially when we think about Black women in healthcare settings, Beyonce and Venus Williams, for example, having giving birth and having problems, right? And the doctor's not listening. So I think there is a need to understand people's concern as a human beings that know that their voices can be heard, even when there's negotiations about getting to the root cause of the issue. Hearing the person first and working from that can make the world of a difference, instead of shutting people down at the onset of the discussion. So I think that research first that recognizes how biases creep into medical personnel, and two, the need for people to recognize the human being on the other end of the clipboard, right? And so recognizing those two things, I think, can move us in a direction where people can get adequate health care and be with their primary care physician in a way that it's a mutual point of respect. I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there another question from the audience? Yes.
Hi, my name's Pia Corujo. I'm a third-year medical student here at UB. And my question is also for Dr. Williams. First of all, thank you to all the panelists for speaking to us tonight. Dr. Williams, in one of your studies, you emphasized the importance of within-group analysis as opposed to using solely between-group analysis when it comes to understanding the heterogeneity that exists within Black Americans as a group, and using that within-group focus to guide what structural changes are the most appropriate and necessary today. My question is, in terms of healthcare and the social determinants of health, what are some questions you think we should be asking as researchers for that within-group analysis of how Black Americans experience health in order to yield actionable structural change items that we as healthcare providers can work on?
Wow. So first things first, when someone does the reading, wow. So I appreciate you engaging my work. It's always flattering and humble. Thinking when you write this stuff, you don't know whether or not you and the other two people that you engaging in the work are only people going to read it. So I appreciate you engaging my work. And I, for the last 5 years, I've been making that argument for kind of within group analyses. What we have done, and part of the reason, so I'm gonna give you context first and then I'll answer your question. So what we have done in empirical science when it comes to racial disparities or disproportionalities in a given outcome, whether that's health or economic outcomes like wealth, children's well-being, et cetera. What we have done is done analyses in which the people who are racialized as white become the reference group in these analyses. In order for it to run the analysis, you need that reference group in order to calculate the differences between groups. So anyway, so we've been doing that for years, and what has happened is the mechanism that we may find important, let's say, for example, for the sake of the argument, education. So education enter a kind of regression-based analyses with white as the reference group and black as the group that gets the thing, right, education or not, and we see that some variance is explained between the groups on a particular outcome. And for me, that says nothing. It says just a gap exists, and the use of that mechanism still tells us a gap exists, right? Because and what ends up happening is that people racialized as white become the standard against which people racialized as black are measured, right? And so what ends up happening in that context is that the history of people racialized as black is often muted or rendered invisible, right? In a way, because you're trying to compare apples to apples, but you can't. Part of the racial categorization is because of apples to oranges, right? And so looking at within race heterogeneity becomes extremely important because it's not like all people racialized as black have health problems. So when you do a within race study or within group study, you can look at the mechanisms that may be uniquely germane to that group. So if I talk about people living, and some of my work does, looking at people with who live in predominantly black neighborhoods, for example. Well, I can't use that measure for the white respondents because by virtue of being in a predominantly black neighborhood, you have to be racialized as black. So that mechanism may not be germane to the population of people who are racialized as white. So what that does is two things. I done got my second win. Yeah, I've been writing on this for a while, y'all. So the first thing is recognizing that mechanisms may be unique to a particular population of people, right? So that's the first thing. And it's also for people racialized as white, right? Like that's do within race studies for people racialized as white too, because the mechanism may be unique to their set of experiences. So when you look at within the same population, people who have the treatment, people who have the thing and people versus people who don't, what are the mechanisms that account for that gap within the population? Now you're not comparing apples to oranges, you're comparing apples to apples at that point. Now the mechanism, if the mechanism of education is doing something, for the example, is doing something for positive health outcomes, then we can make the recommendation that it is education. Usually it's not, but I'm just, work with me with the example, people. So when you're looking at within kind of group heterogeneity, you can isolate the mechanism. That's the important piece. The second, which is even more important, is that the policy implications become much more unique to that particular group. And what happens sometimes, often, is when we do race comparative studies, it runs the risk of reproducing an essentialist interpretation of race. And so I'm trying my hardest to move away from that. So although, again, social sciences say race is socially constructed, the way our empirical models are designed comes out of statistics, which has a legacy with eugenics and yada, 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 right? And so we're still using the remnants of eugenics, right, in our analytic models. And so I'm pushing back. I'm not the only one. There's people who came before me who've been making those arguments since the 90s. I'm just continuing the conversation because it still happens. So I hope I answered your question there.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask if we could have one more question, if possible. Yes, we have a hand here. And maybe we have two questions. Do we have two questions? We have another question up here. Okay, we can. I think we can manage two more questions.
Hi, my name is Sergio. I'm a medical student here at the school. And while you were going through, this is really addressed to the entire panel, but while you were going through the slides, I did notice that while those who identified as Black and Hispanic were lower on like some of the like household earnings and like the maternal mortalities, like they had worse outcomes, one minority group that I noticed consistently outperformed even people who racialize as white are Asians. So what is it that Asians have, or do Asians have like some kind of special advantage that those who identify as black and Hispanic don't?
I would be more than happy to address that question. This is the problem of how we do racial categorization in the United States. So what you're seeing is a byproduct because people asked, matter of fact, those types of data points often lead to people assuming that people of Asian descent is somehow, it is often used against black and brown people to say, see, that's a minority group. They're making it in the United States, right? That's how they sound to me. So what you're seeing is a aggregate of a whole bunch of quote unquote people who are in that Asian category. If we were to as the scholar who read my paper and talk about within group heterogeneity, that's why within group heterogeneity is important. Because just calling a group Asian when you have so many groups within that category, you're missing a couple of things. You're missing people who are at the extreme end of the economic distribution, and then you're missing people who are immigrants who are what we call selection effects, that people who are coming to the United States, for example, with the intention of getting higher education or already have higher levels of education. So the category itself means nothing in reality. Again, because racial groups are socially constructed, it gives the illusion that they're real. So when we interpret it as, oh, what's up with the Asian category? They're doing so much better, even more so than people racialized as white. Well, if you ask someone who's part of a quote-unquote Asian group who are doing really bad in this country, will have a different set of opinions about that particular category. So my challenge to you is that category itself, and thus all racial categorizations, are problematic. And so when we don't get at that, it appears as if there may be something uniquely wonderful about a particular category of people, but the category is misleading because there's too many groups within the Asian category to really speak on it. So if you broke that out, my last point, my continuation of the same point, is that that's why. That your question is the reason why within group heterogeneity, the analysis is important to do. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? I think maybe two. We have two, so we'll take this gentleman and then we'll take this lady here.
Hi, my name is Carlos Calderon. I'm a freshman. So before I ask my question, I would like to contextualize it first. So Dr. Williams, earlier when you were speaking and you were giving the map about, like, it had like the red areas and the orange areas. I forget specifically what it was. Could you remind me of what it was?
It's a map of the of areas in Buffalo by zip code.
Yes. Okay, and then so the reason why is because you made the little statement about let's build a community garden really quick. And the reason why I want to contextualize my question with that is because I feel like right now Buffalo is about to make a grave mistake in the form of building a community garden, in the form of capping a highway in our city. And the reason why I say this is because it's a $921 million investment. And the governor's touting it as an investment to the east side. However, how is it an investment into the east side and rebuilding the community when we still have children suffering from lead poisoning, from unrefurbished homes due to historical bank redlining, families suffering from food apartheid due to there being only one supermarket in the east side, and people who don't have access to jobs due to disinvestment from public transport to communities that need the most? Do you think this is truly an investment that will help the people of the east side?
Wow. So there, to me, those types of strategies, I want to believe comes from a good place. I really do. I want to believe. I've been in groups with community organizers and scholars, and I did the tongue-in-cheek with community gardens, because what happens is I've heard that no matter where I lived, when we talk about black inequality, black inequities, someone mentions a community garden. It like never fails. And I'm like, what? So I started looking up, like, is there some magic elixir in community gardens? Like, sign me up then. Let me give you some lettuce and tomatoes, right? Like, what is it doing, right? And I think people really have good intentions. What I believe is happening, and so I'm not going to answer your question. I'm not from here, so I don't know I don't know. I tend not to answer questions when I'm ignorant about certain things, and so instead of forcing an answer into the question, I kind of contextualize it back to you. Okay, so I think the assumption is about healthy eating and access to food, etc. But to your point, I think although well-intentioned, it leapfrogs over a whole bunch of other stuff. Like in my imagination, I wish people were adamant as adamant about reparations than they would be about community gardens. And so I don't see it as a negative outright. My kind of tongue-in-cheek comment was that it seems as if you want to do something at this really micro like level with good intentions, but people have way more serious problems than that. And I think there's a disconnect between people's good intention and the brutal reality of what's happening on the ground. And that disconnect often leads to a kind of metaphorical white savior narrative from political from people in office, who hold political office, because it looks good, but there's a disconnect with reality. And I'm not anti-community garden. I don't want anyone to walk away from here. I just think on the list of things that people need, people need money. People need like time. People need a whole bunch of other stuff, just as broad examples. And so it's not a critique of community gardens itself, but why preface this thing over another thing? So that's my context back to you.
I thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. I really do feel an urgency to respond. Even I'm going to take myself out of the role of facilitator just for one moment, because I think it's really important to understand the story, as Dr. Stewart shared his context about his position and what he does. And one of the things that I want to just lift is that I am a member of the community where this cap will be installed. I want you to know that the community has fought for this cap for many decades. This highway was developed by Robert Moses. He destroyed communities all around this country, and he destroyed this neighborhood. Not only that, poisons have been emitted in the air as a result of this highway through the neighborhood. We will never get the lives back of individuals who have lost their lives to chronic conditions as a result of this highway through our neighborhood. Also, it's our neighborhood, and we do have a right to prioritize what's important to us. And what we've experienced with this big debate that's been going on is that outsiders have been making decisions and making comment on how $1 billion should be spent in our neighborhood. And we're saying not this or that. We're saying this and that. $1 billion here and $1 billion there. And $1 billion everywhere, and not just for our community, but for every community. And so we don't want to fight over pittance, because $1 billion is pittance when it compares to the lives of individuals that are dead and those who are dying from cancers and other upper respiratory maladies. So, I think it's really important to talk to the people who these things are happening to, because I think you miss a piece when you don't know the full story, as Dr. Stewart was sharing a little bit ago. I think on the surface, it looks like your question was really compassionate to the community and thinking about the lives of those who live in the community, but you got to talk to the people who live in the community. And this is where community-based participatory research is really important. Some of what Chandra was talking about with regard to $20 gift cards and, make your PhD and publish and get your, seat at the academy comes in. So I think it's really important for us as a university and for all of the universities that are represented in this room to talk to the people, find out what they're thinking. Some of it's reparations. You destroyed our neighborhood, you destroyed lives in our community, and we want it back. It was a beautiful, it wasn't a community garden. It was a beautiful tree-lined mall like that on Lincoln Parkway, like that on Chapin Parkway, like that on many parts of our Olmsted Park system. It was destroyed to make a way for suburbanites to get to Amherst. I didn't mean to say Amherst. So I really appreciate your question. At first I was feeling a certain kind of way. I'll just keep your role as moderator, Rita, don't say anything. But I do think it's important, and I had a conversation. I do serve on the Hamlin Park Community and Taxpayers Association. And just this week we were having a conversation about what we need to say as taxpayers that live in this neighborhood when these things are coming up, because we see the placards coming up and being placed on lawns, and they're really slick, like no toxic tunnel and things like that. You can't respond to a placard. You can't respond to a piece of paper that's been stuck in the ground. But we need to have these conversations. So thank you so much for your question. Thank you so much for allowing me to come out of a safe space of moderation to share with you the perspective of a resident that lives in the neighborhood and why, to us, it's so important. And not only is it a symbol, but we would hope that our community would be healthier as a result, and connect us back to the other side of Hamlin Park that's been destroyed. That's on the side where Fillmore Avenue is. Connect us back to our neighborhood. Yeah. So thank you for your question and allowing me to come out of the role of facilitator or moderator. We had one more question. This is our final question. And then Dr. Williams, if you would mind just giving us sort of a reflection on about 5 minutes of what it is that we've had a conversation about today. Ms.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here, for all of our panelists, and thank you, Dr. Williams, for your talk. I definitely enjoyed it and was happy to take a study break to attend. My name is Sydney Johnson, and I'm currently a second-year medical student here at the Jacob School, and my question was geared towards what you talked about in terms of intentionality and like us as like medical professionals, and how you don't have to be like intentionally like an overtly racism to be perpetuating the structure. And I wanted to ask a question about like self-selecting. So a lot of us have all self-selected to be here, and I'm also like, to anyone who has listened for like on the curriculum committee, I'm like, these conversations are not ones that should be optional, like especially for people who are going to be going out into the community and treating people. So how do we, like, and the school is making changes and like in making these conversations part of the foundation of the curriculum, but how do we access the people who have chosen not to be here? And how do we sorry, thank you. Yeah, how do we attack those people, and then how do we get them to understand that while they may not be like overtly racist, but like by choosing not to be part of these conversations are still perpetuating that structure?
Wow. Wow.
Dr. Williams, if you don't mind answering her question and also embedding your summation.
Say less.
Yeah. Because we've been, yeah.
Can I just say one thing? As a provider that hires physicians, before you close, Dr. Williams, let me just say this. Please take care of yourselves, because the racist structure that you're in has a way of destroying us before I can even hire you. When you get to me and we want to interview you, particularly those of us of color, get the support you need, because by the time you get to me, you're broken, so broken. The anxiety, the stress, the depression, because you've been working really hard navigating. But take advantage of us out here in the community. That's where you've been, where you're at, and where we've gone, where we are, to help you and support you, any of you. I don't care if you're in surgery, I don't care if you're in primary care. You have to seek us out, because all of us survive with each other. Because it's a rough road, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, because I'm sitting here because I hire. And I'm telling you, by the time you see me at the end of your residency and you're starting to work, you're barely making it holding it together. So please make sure you seek us out to support. You have to support Dr. Bashir's here. She's connected to the community. She's connected to me. She's connected to a lot of us that's already graduated from here. Don't forget, we all are working together. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much.
I have a quick comment because Dr. Williams is very loquacious, so let me get mine in right quickly. I would just say this in terms of answering your question. Don't be aiders and abettors to people who act racist and anti-Semitic. And how you do that is you call them on it. Why didn't you attend last night? You know, what was more important, short of death, what was more important? You know, you come at them like that. I'll share one little story. I was teaching a social problem class. I had a student in the class who she was biracial. I mean, she was married to a black person. She was white, and she said that they took their child over to the grandparents' house for Thanksgiving, and I think it was her father said about her child, his grandchild, "Come here, my little niglet," and sit next to granddad. I tell you, y'all got some racist language up here in Buffalo I ain't never heard of. Thank you. It's crazy.
Before Dr. Williams says anything, I just want to say something about soon-to-be Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a product of a project that we had at a hospital that I worked at ECMC. When was that? 2000?
I was young. I want to say like maybe 2014.
Yeah, I know, like 10 years ago. Oh my God. She was a budding, promising starlet and came to the University of Buffalo, Erie County Medical Center to learn about the medical profession. And she was one of our stars. She was very serious at the time. We knew something was going to happen that would be great in her life. And all I had hoped was that I could be a little fly on the wall. And look at this. eloquent, beautiful. Much like Dr. Stewart was saying about Dr. Sunville, this is what it's all about. It's about the ways in which we can sow into younger people to help them to get to where it is that they want to go, with the supports that Dr. Ansari was talking about, all the way up and through. So I do think that this conversation amongst ourselves, the things that we do intentionally every day in our work, are all part of the mix that needs to occur. The intellectual, the work on the ground, all of it. It's not this or that. It's not $1 billion for a highway and nothing else for the houses and nothing else for the other parts of the community. It's all of these things. So with that, we're going to ask our esteemed lecturer today to answer our last question and to wrap up so that Dr. Schweizberg can come up for final comments. So up to you. Sydney's question.
Oh, I thought that had already been answered twice.
Oh, then you're right.
So let's have a conversation afterwards instead of doing the panel thing for the sake of time, all right? Can we do that? Sweet, appreciate you. So in summation, part of what I'm trying to do with my work is expose nuance. So we know empirically that racial disparities in health exist and persist in this country. And I'm asking us to step back and say, why? To ask why. And it's not just about structural racism, it's how racism becomes structured. When we use language loosely, like structural racism, then it loses its metaphorical sting if understanding how change needs to take place. So when we ask the question, does racism lead to race, or does race lead to racism, and how a person answers that question says a lot about their assumptions around race and racism. There shouldn't be any essentialist assumptions, is my point. We should understand that race is socially constructed, but the critical question it becomes, for whom and for what purpose was race socially constructed? When we answer that question, we can understand its genesis, how it ends and become recreated, and then we can start highlighting the mechanisms, not to account for the gap in health, but what maintains it. And if we can answer the question that maintains it, then we can find ways to end it. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of you and your fortitude and your bladders for doing this. So Laverne and Ron and Chandra and Rita, thank you so much. Really, thank you. And to Frankie and Pia and Sydney, thank you, because why isn't everybody here? We don't profess to do this easy. These are hard conversations. These are things that people don't really want to always hear. So the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. But we have a thing here in the Department of Surgery. I'm going to give you something that I know you don't have. It is our
$1 million?
Yeah, me too. It's our traditional crystal buffalo, and we hope that you'll always remember your visit and how awesome the weather was while you were here. And for all of you in the audience, please don't hesitate to go through those doors, enjoy the great stuff from Golden Cup Coffee, and enjoy the pastries from Jackie. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, we hope you'll come back to Buffalo sometime soon. So, thank you all. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Steve. Awesome work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, yes.
Dr. Williams, I'm from Amherst. Just kidding. Great speech.
Thank you. Thank you so much.